So, can you please define to me what loneliness is and explain how people typically come to be lonely?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, and actually probably something that's not all that easy to define. And one of the reasons is that I think sometimes we think of something like loneliness as being a social experience around, I suppose, access to people, access to meaningful relationships. But I think that probably is a little bit too simple for loneliness, because it's as much as it is a social experience, I think it's an internal experience. I know lots of people can describe being surrounded by people, but if those social relationships don't kind of stimulate a connection, or if they feel like they're not meaningful in a way that people want them to be, then they can still feel lonely when surrounded by people. So in trying to define it, I think it's probably a mixture of both a social experience in terms of feeling connected to other people on, I think, probably an emotional level, but also an internalized experience around the meaning that you place on the relationships that you have, and people who, I suppose, the relationship they have don't give them, if it doesn't give them that meaning, then they can end up feeling lonely as well. Yeah, I kind of think of loneliness, and this might be a slightly naive perspective, but something similar to how people think about depression. So, and I think they're pretty similar. If you look at things like a lot of the risk factors for depression, I mean, loneliness and social withdrawal are probably sky high up there. So I think they go hand in hand. So when you're thinking about the consequences of loneliness, I suppose a lot of people, and this is me kind of guessing is probably the wrong word, but me kind of,
Hypothesizing,
yeah,
or
hypothesizing. I would imagine people would quite often feel quite isolated, maybe quite apathetic. So when you're on your own for a long time, it can be difficult to kind of drum up the motivation to do things that you like to do. They can, so although people can be isolated, the secondary impact is that they then start isolating themselves. People might often have some difficult thoughts, especially if there's an internal experience around, as you said earlier, body dysmorphia. If people are experiencing that, then they can avoid seeking out um, interactions that might challenge some of the negative thoughts they have in their head. So you can get people, when they're isolated, almost getting a bit stuck with some thoughts or beliefs that they hold about themselves, and there's nothing to challenge that or to shift that way of thinking. People can sometimes end up feeling quite suicidal. They can lose a sense of joy. Things that used to bring them pleasure or joy end up feeling quite muted, and they don't get the same, I suppose, positive experiences in life, even if they're sorry, I should reword that. Even if they're having the same experiences, they're not getting the same positive affect or emotional response to it. So I suppose it kind of strips away a lot of the things that make us feel like ourselves, and the things that make us feel good.
hmm. Um, can you quickly explain to me kind of what the differences you see in people who go through short-term spells of loneliness? Um, that can be lockdown, or
Mm,
perhaps they go and work in a different country where they don't have many friends for a while, and
yeah.
that kind of scenario, and long-term loneliness, where you see people typically over older age, when they get to
Mm,
their 80s and they lose contact with people, widows, possibly
yeah.
victims of abuse. Can you kind of explain the differences you see in those kinds of loneliness?
Yeah, I think, I suppose, I would think that for short-term loneliness, it quite often it's brought about by, I suppose, a change in circumstances, and it's not brought about necessarily by an internalized process. So what I mean by that is that, like, if we think about lockdown, we're in lockdown now. We know lockdown will end at a certain point. So people often adopt methods of coping that can kind of tie them over in the short term. And because there's not an internalized or a kind of a mental health drive that's causing people to avoid social interactions. Quite often, people can cope in the short term, or they can seek out social interactions in other forms, like we're kind of doing now, or like on different social media. I know certainly with lockdowns, I've gotten my family have communicated much more over Zoom. So people are able to, I suppose, cope and adjust in the short term. Um, Long term, I think is different because in the short term, there's quite small ways people can cope by changing things and knowing that this isn't going to go forever. Whereas in the long term, I think what's different is people are drawn into having to have almost like um, an adjustment, and that can be kind of a mental adjustment where if they know that the situation is chronic, they have to change something about themselves in order to try to get through this. So I suppose a good example is in a lockdown, we know it's temporary, so people will cope in all sorts of ways, and they may cope in not very healthy ways, but because it's short term, they can kind of get through that. And then once things go back to normal, they kind of pick up and connect to people again. Whereas if it's long term and people adopt those same coping strategies, quite often that doesn't quite do it. And then people are at risk of having, I suppose, becoming depressed or socially isolated and not knowing where to pick up from that. So I think long term, it requires a different kind of adjustment process than short term, which is almost like the difference between short term coping is a bit like sticking a sticky plaster over a wound, knowing that you just need to cover it up for a while and then it'll get better itself. Whereas long term, it's actually having to kind of go in there, surgically manipulate it, and change things fundamentally in order to try to cope and to reach, I suppose, a status of not feeling lonely. Does that
Yeah, no, that
make
answers the
sense?
question absolutely. So this is kind of a bit off topic, but when people turn to kind of like substance abuse,
Hmm.
or it doesn't necessarily have to be substance abuse, it can be
Yeah.
social media platforms and that kind of thing.
Mm,
What, you know, you said it typically is fine in the short term.
mm.
Um, is there a large risk of people using these coping mechanisms in short term and then them using it in the long term anyway? Because as a coping mechanism, it makes you feel better. And do
Yeah,
people
yeah,
typically assume that it'll make them feel better even when they kind of have their lives back or like their social
yeah.
interactions back?
I think it's a really good question. I don't think there's a straightforward answer to it, but what I know is that people, I think humans are, on the whole, very resilient creatures. And part of the reason humans have been so successful is that they're very good at adapting to change. People cope with distress in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. And I think it's really important that, I suppose, from my perspective, I don't pathologize how people cope because some people can cope with gambling. It's not the way I would cope. In the short term, as long as there's no kind of really harmful consequences, if it gets them through it, something, then that's, I don't really have an opinion on it then. And people use all sorts of different things. And I think the only time it becomes problematic is if their way of coping ends up increasing their distress and they get stuck in this kind of pattern where instead of bringing them closer to to joy and to something that brings value to their lives, actually they get stuck in this coping cycle where they keep doing something that keeps making them feel worse. And for some people that can be exercise, for example, where people over exercise and they're trying to create almost like a body image through exercise, and it's a never ending process. And I think it's a bit risky to think of how we cope in too simplistic a way where we think about it as good or bad coping, because things work for lots of different people. So yeah, I think it's not necessarily about what the coping is, it's what the consequences of that are for the individual. So does it leave the person feeling you know happy, connected to other people, a sense of joy? Does it bring them close to the values, or does it leave them kind of more burnt out? And with gambling, a lot of people, or substance abuse, for example, a lot of people I suppose it's tricky with substance abuse because I think the official line I should say is that you shouldn't do it. But I mean, a lot of people use things recreationally, certainly with alcohol. I would imagine, I don't know this for sure, but I'd imagine kind of recreational drinking at home has probably gone up hugely. And for a lot of people, that's okay. It's not great, but there's not massively harmful consequences, and they're able to switch out of that and revert back to the normal behavior. For some people, though, that change in behavior can be really unsettling. And for those people, you would maybe think, okay, if this is if this short-term way of coping is now moved into something much more long-term, maybe we need to think about, can you reflect on the impact this is having on you, and do we need to think about changing it?
I bring it up pure more for my own interest, but
Yeah,
I mean, there's an ongoing kind of debate whether lockdowns are possibly causing more harm than good because of the
yeah,
amount that people are looking for these coping mechanisms.
mm,
And I don't expect you to have a completely
yeah,
known answer to this, but do you think it's rational to think that lockdowns could cause more harm than good because of the isolation that it can potentially put people in? Um, or
yeah,
is that a risk, obviously, that needs to be taken in terms of protecting the NHS and
yeah,
all of these others, and
yeah.
the older generation and that kind of thing?
And I suppose I have a perspective on that I've just gotten better from coronavirus. I was pretty ill with it. So I think so. I think anything like a lockdown, you'd never willfully choose to impose a lockdown on someone. That's kind of martial law, where almost like we're in a military state. You'd never do that to people and restrict their freedoms and their liberties unless it was absolutely critical. So, I mean, I think I probably sit somewhere in the middle, in that I think lockdowns are a really serious change on people's basic freedoms, that you would never recommend that people do that. I think at the moment the situation is just so unprecedented that it it, it it's kind of a needs must. But I think making the decision around lockdown, um, people need to do it with their eyes open, because it is a very harmful process, and it's thinking, there's two different harmful things going on. There's lockdown and there's the virus. And the tricky thing is that lockdown doesn't take away the virus spreading. I think we had the record number of deaths today. I still think it's justified, but it's a kind of a cost benefit analysis. And I think I've felt very ill with the virus, and I know that nearly 2,000 people died today. It is endemic and it's having a massive impact. And I think when trying to weigh things up, like if there is no lockdown, the number of people who would die would be vastly higher. And I suppose the way I rationalize it is that I have loved ones who are at risk. Fortunately, no one in my personal life has passed away with COVID, but some people, if they were to get it, I would really worry about them. And I suppose I can kind of rationalize and think that if there was no lockdown, they would almost certainly get it, and they could die from it. So I suppose I'm able to hold that perspective in mind. But uh, I suppose that taps into my own value system and the social relationships that I have, and how that helps me to rationalize this. Because I know people rationalize it in lots of different ways. So I think it certainly is justified, but it comes with a huge cost, and people need to be cognizant of that.
And just because we're talking about rationalizing, and I think it's healthy for people to hear different opinions, that I'd just like
Mm.
to share kind of how I rationalize
Yeah.
lockdown in my mind. Because in the first lockdown, I had an incredibly rough time. It's
Mm.
probably the hardest time in my life, if I'm
Yeah.
like to be completely honest.
Yeah.
Um, but the way I see it is this shared pain throughout kind of the nation and the world.
Mm.
Like, if you think about how powerful grief can be in its kind
Yeah.
of singular form, it's
Yeah.
almost like sharing that load amongst 100 people. It's saving
Yeah.
one person from grief for
Mm.
maybe 100 people feeling down. that's
Yeah.
that's kind of
Yeah.
how I rationalize it in my head and justify why lockdowns you know
Yeah.
are
And
justifiable. So that's kind
yeah,
of how I see it, is sharing that load of grief.
I think it's a different way of thinking about kind of social connectedness. It's instead of just being about your kind of social group,
Mm,
it's something wider. It's a community sense, or actually, it's not even just a country sense. It's like a species sense of
mm.
the sacrifices we need to make for the greater good.
Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen COVID-19 have an effect on loneliness? As in,
Yeah.
like, has the loneliness that you've seen been different in
Mm,
some ways?
yeah.
Obviously there are increased reports of it,
Mm.
but kind of how
So
that manifests.
yeah, so I work in a neuropsychology service. So I work with people who have, I suppose, would be considered high risk. So certainly people after a stroke, generally they're elderly with severe health, con- uh, well, uh, well, quite often long-term conditions, long-term symptoms. I also work with people who've had brain injuries or sometimes recovering from brain tumors or brain infections. So all of the people I would work with um, were shielding and are shielding again. So I suppose in terms of my clinical work, I've seen a number of people who the goal of the kind of work that I would do with someone is normally that they've had this horrible thing happen to them. They're trying to adjust to life with a disability or with some cognitive problems or memory problems. And I'm trying to support them with an adjustment process. And that often involves getting people to experiment, try new things, test it out to see what it's like. And one of the consequences of lockdown is that, especially for people who are shielding, and have been essentially shielding since March, is, I've seen their mental health really, really plummet. And it's challenging because the kind of things that I would normally do as a psychologist and what I'd normally be suggesting, I can't do that. I can't say, oh, well, why don't you head out, go on a walk, see what it's like, because they're not allowed to do that anymore. So I've certainly seen the impact of social isolation on people. And I think in the short term, people were able to kind of cope with it okay, but it's the long-term nature of this, and it's being deprived not just of social connectedness but also of hobbies, of the things that make us feel like ourselves. So I think for all of us, we seek out people and activities that give us an identity. And I think the loneliness that's been caused by lockdown has taken away people's identities, so that they're quite often left just in this kind of weird state of this isn't the right words to describe it, but kind of a meh state, where there's just nothing that they really enjoy doing that they can do, and the people they want to see they can't see, or every conversation becomes dominated about lockdown and people aren't really connecting themselves. So I've certainly seen that in my clients. It's a bit different for me personally because my family are in Ireland, so I'm Irish. So I haven't been home since February last year, so it's coming up to a year. Normally, I get home maybe 4 or 5 times a year, um, but because I don't live at home, I've always kind of had a relationship with my family through quite often WhatsApp, or now we're using Zoom a lot, and different platforms. So I suppose because that's something we've been doing long term, in some ways, lockdown has increased our connectedness because we're using Zoom and we never used to use Zoom, and now we're having family meetings and we never used to do that. So in some ways that's been a positive, but certainly for the clients I work with, I've seen it, and I've seen their mental health just really deteriorate because of lockdown. I felt a bit stuck in knowing how to support them because a lot of the things I would normally suggest just aren't available anymore.
So, kind of while we're on the topic of suggestions of helping people, can
Mm.
you tell me some suggestions of how to deal with loneliness, especially within lockdown? Like, can you teach us some some of the
Yeah.
things you've learned over the
Yeah,
year?
I suppose I don't think I have necessarily a great answer to that. And I think partly because it's very different for every person. And, essentially with lockdown, especially for those who are shielding or long term in this, essentially what you're asking people to do is to forget about all their previous hobbies and forget about the ways that they liked to relate to other people, and learn to do all of that differently. And lockdown aside, if you're asking people to do any of that, that's really hard. That's a lot to ask someone to do. So, and I think one of the sometimes challenges is that people are very good at coming up with practical suggestions of what works for them. But I think the really important thing to say is that what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. So there's no kind of suggestions I can give you that I can say this works for everyone. Everyone needs to do this thing, and they'll feel better and more connected. Because the way that people have social relationships is so different, or the hobbies that they enjoy. So I think it's an adjustment process. It's getting people to think about how they have to change their lives in order to cope. And one of the first things to say is, in order for people to do that, it's quite a deliberate act. So in order for people to change, it's not something that just passively happens. Sometimes it is for people, they just kind of adjust without thinking about it. But with lockdown, when change is kind of forced on us and the things we used to do are no longer available, I think people need to be quite conscious that, okay, what used to keep me going isn't there. I need to try out something new and see, does that work? And I suppose it's like, if you think about yourself, if you've ever tried to find a new hobby, I think with anything, people quite often starting anything new doesn't feel that exciting. It feels a bit like, oh, why do I have to do this? And it takes maybe 4 or 5 times for people to really get a sense of what something is like and whether it's right for them. And in order to try that, I think people need a very kind of committed sense of, I need to try this new thing to see if it works, and to really set their mind to it. So I, yeah, sorry, I think I'm kind of talking around the point. There's no kind of one thing or particular trick or strategy that I would say, do this and your social connectedness would feel better. I think it's for every individual. It's about supporting them to engage in that kind of problem solving process of thinking, what other things could you do? What steps do you need to do in order to try that out? If you try it out initially, are you going in with the expectation of not enjoying it, or are you open-minded to it? Then trying it out and thinking, could you do this a bit more? And it's a discovery process for every individual in terms of trying to adjust to lockdown and to an imposed isolation.
So taking that answer into account, that there
Yeah.
is, every individual has
Hmm.
their own ways of coping and
Yeah.
learning how to cope. Do you know if there are trends between different demographics? I'll ask specifically between young and older people, how they deal with loneliness typically. It doesn't necessarily have to be within lockdown, but
Yeah.
just out in the greater wide world when we're all allowed outside and to talk to each other. Can you
Yeah.
talk about how the different demographics tend to try to deal with loneliness?
Yeah, I think I suppose I'm certainly happy to answer that as well as I can, but my perspective on it is my perspective. This isn't kind of based on empirical research or anything like that. I suppose it's just what I've noticed. But certainly younger people, there's a significant more larger push to social media, and I think social media is both a really positive thing and a really dangerous thing. And my understanding around social media and how people kind of uh, I don't know, cope socially through social media is that it's not necessarily about social media being good or bad. It's about how you engage with it. And if people are using it, like I was describing with my family, to like with Zoom, we're using it in order to, I suppose, foster a sense of intimacy and closeness and connectedness and catching up. That's really good. And social media like Zoom gives us an opportunity to do that in a way that we couldn't before. Whereas social media, in terms of things like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, which I think are less about connecting people and more about creating this kind of virtual life and almost like branding yourself or publishing an idealized version of yourself. And when we engage in this idea of publishing an idealized version of ourselves, we actually, instead of bringing people closer together, the research, this bit has research, the research would say that actually that brings people further away from each other. So when we're using social media to, I suppose, kind of feed it via narcissism or an ego, or when we're distorting our reality to paint a picture that things are slightly different to how they are, that isn't a helpful process in terms of people's well-being. And I think thinking about the different demographics, um, certainly social media use is endemic among young people. That's definitely the case. I think most young people engage with it in some way or another. I think a lot of kind of parents, and I know people around the kind of 40 to 60 age group use a lot of Facebook. It very much depends on how they're using it. If, as I said, it's used to create, to distort their reality and create like an artificial reality, then that's not helpful for loneliness. It's helpful for boredom. It feeds or it meets other needs that people have, but not necessarily for loneliness. Whereas if it's actually genuinely connecting with people, talking about the reality, not trying to distort reality, and using it to increase intimacy and connectedness, that's really good. I think older people, so probably kind of 60 plus bracket, it, I think it's useful to be reminded that a lot of the clients I have who are older don't have Wi-Fi, or if they do, they don't have a fast connection because they don't use it for very much. Or they might sometimes they'll have a smartphone because most phones are smart, but wouldn't be comfortable using it. Certainly, social media would kind of be an alien thing to them, and for them, a lot of their connections are over the phone. And I think it's interesting because phone calls that they would make, in some ways there's a barrier that you can't see the person, um, so it's this barrier, but equally the phone is so wonderfully simple that it's just designed to promote connectedness, and that's the kind of medium that they would have done that for most of their lives. So I think in some ways it's healthier, even though there's not all of the options that they have. um, yeah,
Yeah.
does that,
Yeah, that answers the question nicely. Yeah.
I think as well for younger people's social worlds are so much bigger. So younger people or students or kind of yeah, people can often name like lots of friends, lots of kind of acquaintances, there's family. There's although it's a generalization, there's just kind of a bigger social world. Whereas I think when people get a bit older, their social world becomes much much smaller, and they're able to often list kind of a number of really close friends, and that's because there's different responsibilities and commitments and work and less time to devote to social needs. But I think because people's social worlds become smaller, there's often I suppose a bit more intimacy in those relationships. Whereas when people are younger, there's lots of friends but maybe a bit of distance between them. It's almost like people are spoiled for choice, and that's both a blessing and a curse. I think so. Just to say, I had Googled it beforehand, and I got something very different. That was, I think it probably is the same thing, but what you just showed me had like a lot of visual information on it, whereas this was, um, maybe is it the main website? Just the about page has a lot less. I think from what you've described, and I might be kind of missing out on quite a bit of it, but it seems like it's trying to, I suppose, engage people in hobbies and entertainment. And it's doing it in a way that increases some degree of social relationship. But I suppose it's trying to think about it feels like the focus is on the activity, but making the activity interactive and a bit more personal, which I think is really good. I don't think of it as, from what you showed me, something that fosters the kind of intimacy and connectedness. So I suppose if we think about the impact of the pandemic and thinking about, there's two things that are really important. One is maintaining social relationships and doing that in a slightly different way. And the other is engaging in new hobbies and finding new things that interest you in order to live kind of a stimulated life. And it feels like Twitch, from what you showed me, is a really good way of doing that. And I think, there's millions of things on the internet, and lots of things that, you could say to almost anyone out there that, there will be things you haven't seen before on the internet that you will enjoy. And quite often the barrier is, I suppose, like the barrier for everything, is getting people to make that first step or commit to it, or that hook that pulls them into it. And it feels like the way Twitch had, I suppose you could comment, you could ask the person questions, they were live streaming it. I think that is a really good way of kind of hooking people into it and getting them initially kind of pulled in. And once you get people pulled in, then they generally stay around.
Yeah.
So it
Um,
feels like a really good way of getting people into new activities or to stimulate interest.
and what are kind of the signs that people can look out for if they are becoming too attached to these platforms?
That's a good question. I suppose again, I don't think there's necessarily a sweeping statement for all people. I think about a friend of mine who I thought was probably addicted to, I think it was Facebook, or Instagram, and she'd post a picture and would post it, and then was immediately driven, like this really powerful anxiety would come over her to see how many people would end up liking it. Or is that, I don't know if that's what you do for Instagram, liking,
I
or
believe so. I don't use
yeah,
it, but
okay.
I think so.
She would become really anxious about how many people would like it and couldn't really focus on anything else. And for her, the social media became almost like a type of validation that she would post something. If she didn't get enough likes, she would end up feeling terrible. And if she did get enough likes, she would end up having this need around kind of, I don't know if it's a narcissism or,
A validation kind
yeah,
of,
she would
yeah.
have that validated, that need validated, and then she would feel great for the rest of the day. And I think when I suppose in the site, when I think of the work that I do with people, I would often kind of steer them away from coping mechanisms that are entirely dependent on other people, because we can't control other people. And if you end up, how you feel about yourself is entirely based on the validation you get from an online community that kind of don't really exist, in that they're just faceless ticks. Um, you're kind of falling into an anxiety trap where posting it is actually triggering an anxiety process, and then the feeling you get of like, oh, this feels great, is probably a bit of euphoria, but it's also the absence of anxiety when the anxiety goes away, and you just engaging with something that is being driven by anxiety. And sometimes people have this kind of this almost like a switch where they flip between being anxious to then being narcissistic. So either I'm afraid everyone hates me, now I'm validated, everyone loves me, now I'm really popular, and there's no in between. And I think if people end up, and I've seen other people as well who end up engaging with social media, and that kind of switch between anxiety and narcissism becomes their reality. And I think if that happens, that's not a healthy process. So that's certainly one of the kind of things that I would think to look out for. And I know some people who do that and are very successful with it would probably say, you know, but I value it and it's important to me. And I wouldn't kind of challenge it in that sense. It's just as a coping mechanism. When something's driven by anxiety, I think it's generally not something that's necessarily helpful. Someone once explained to me that there's two different drives. There's the things that we're trying to avoid and things that we want to move towards. And the things we want to move towards are things that match our values. And when we think about what's really important in our life, what values we have, and trying to find a way to move towards them. And I think that's always the right direction to go. Whereas things we're trying to avoid is our own kind of sense of fallibility, or our anxieties around being popular, or these kind of anxieties that stick with us. And if the behavior of going on social media is being used to get rid of the anxiety as a primary drive, I think that's probably not a healthy process. If you're going on social media and all you're finding is that you're getting closer to your values, then great for you, you know. So I would say if it's an anxiety process, you're better off stepping away from it entirely than thinking you can long term get that need met through social media, because you can't. It just spirals.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all the questions that I have planned. Do you feel like there's anything else that you would like to touch on or that we've missed or
No, I think what's nice about talking is that loneliness is a massive problem that I think most people will experience that at least once or multiple times in their lives. It's a really normal experience in some ways, but a really horrible one at the same time. And I think sometimes we don't talk about it enough, or we only talk about it in terms of the elderly, and concerns about them being lonely. But actually, the link between loneliness and mental health is really profound. And I can think of times in my life where I've been lonely. I haven't known many people. I've moved somewhere new, and I felt really crap because of that. And it's easy to pathologize that from a mental health angle and say, "Oh, you're depressed," or "Oh, this, whatever else it is." But actually, loneliness is what drives a lot of that. So it's really nice to be able to talk about it and to hear your questions and to think about it not from the lens of this is mental health and loneliness is a symptom of a mental health problem, but just from the lens of this is human experience that we all relate to at the moment in a pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things that everybody's heard of, and it's quite trendy. Like loneliness is a trendy topic,
Mm,
and I think it's really helpful to kind of demystify what it actually is, what it can cause, what
yeah,
causes it, and the whole
yeah,
dynamic, because it's the root cause of things, and it's a symptom of others,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
it's all around us. And so, thank you for enlightening us a bit more about what loneliness is
Well,
and what we can do.
insofar as I understand it, I
Yes.
don't profess to be an expert at all.
No, not at
Um,
all. But you certainly know more than I feel like a lot of us would, and as I'm sure you would as well. Don't take just your words or our words as gospel.
hmm,
Do your own research if you're interested in
yeah,
loneliness and the topic of loneliness. Get more opinions on the topic because people will are studying it and will study it for years to come.
yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely.
thank you so much for the interview. It's been
Ideal.
fantastic.
Well, it's lovely to speak to you, Simon.
Thank you.